Did you know that during the siege of Acre, 20,000 defenders faced off against just 9,700 attackers and still lost? Or that this siege lasted for 2 grueling years, claiming countless lives on both sides? These aren't just numbers. They represent real people caught in one of history's most complex and brutal military encounters. By the end of this video, you'll understand why the siege of Acre wasn't just a battle. It was a microcosm of medieval warfare itself, showcasing every aspect from advanced technology to psychological manipulation. The strategic importance of Acre. As the Crusaders and Muslim forces converged on Acre in the late 12th century, the city's strategic importance became increasingly apparent. Situated on the eastern Mediterranean coast, Acre served as a vital gateway to the Holy Land, its natural harbour providing a crucial entry point for European forces and supplies. The city's geographical position made it an indispensable asset for any power seeking to control the region, as it offered a foothold from which to launch further campaigns into the interior. Acre's economic significance further heightened its value as a military target. The city had long been a bustling centre of trade, where merchants from across the Mediterranean and beyond exchanged goods, ideas, and cultures. Its busy port facilitated the movement of valuable commodities, such as spices, textiles, and precious metals, generating substantial wealth for its rulers. Control of Acre meant control of these lucrative trade routes, providing a significant economic advantage to whichever side held the city. The strategic value of Acre was not lost on either the Christian or Muslim forces. For the Crusaders, the city represented a crucial stepping stone in their quest to reclaim and maintain a presence in the Holy Land. It offered a secure base of operations from which to launch further incursions into Muslim-held territories and to defend their hard-won gains. The port's capacity to receive reinforcements and supplies from Europe was vital for sustaining the Crusader presence in a hostile region. Conversely, for the Muslim forces led by Saladin, Acre's importance lay in its potential to serve as a choke point, effectively cutting off the Crusaders' lifeline to Europe. By controlling the city, Saladin could severely hamper the ability of Christian forces to maintain their foothold in the Levant, potentially dealing a decisive blow to the Crusader states. The defensive capabilities of Acre further enhanced its strategic value. The city boasted formidable fortifications, including thick walls and imposing towers that had been strengthened and expanded over centuries of conflict. These defenses, combined with the natural advantages of its coastal position, made Acre a challenging target for any would-be conqueror. The city's ability to withstand prolonged sieges meant that whoever controlled it could expect to hold it for an extended period, barring an extraordinary effort by opposing forces. Acre's political significance extended beyond its immediate military value. The city had changed hands multiple times throughout its history, passing between various powers, including the Fatimids, Seljuks, and Crusaders. Each transfer of control represented a shift in the balance of power in the region. As such, the possession of Acre carried with it a symbolic weight, demonstrating the ascendancy of one side over the other in the ongoing struggle for dominance in the Holy Land. The city's history of changing allegiances also meant that its population was diverse, comprising Christians, Muslims, and Jews who had lived under various rulers. This demographic complexity added another layer to the strategic calculations of both sides. Whoever controlled Acre would need to navigate the challenges of governing a multi-faith population while maintaining their grip on power. As tensions mounted, and both Christian and Muslim forces recognized the pivotal role Acre would play in their broader campaigns, the stage was set for a protracted and bitter struggle. The city's strategic value ensured that neither side could afford to ignore it, and both were willing to commit significant resources to its capture or defense. The inevitability of a siege became increasingly apparent as both sides maneuvered for position. The Crusaders, eager to regain a foothold in the Holy Land after recent setbacks, saw Acre as their best chance to establish a secure base of operations. Saladin, aware of the threat posed by a reinvigorated Crusader presence, recognized the need to prevent the city from falling into enemy hands. The gathering storm, opposing forces, converge. As the spectre of siege loomed over Acre, a fundamental question emerged. What could drive thousands of men to risk life and limb for a single city? The answer lay not just in stone and mortar, but in the complex web of faith, power, and destiny that would soon draw two great forces into a clash of epic proportions. At the heart of this impending conflict stood two formidable leaders, Guy of Lusignan, the recently deposed king of Jerusalem, and Saladin, the Sultan of Egypt and Syria. Guy of Lusignan, a French nobleman who had ascended to the throne of Jerusalem through marriage, found himself in a precarious position. Having suffered a crushing defeat at the Battle of Hattin in 1187, which resulted in the loss of Jerusalem and much of the Crusader kingdom, Guy was desperate to reclaim his power and legitimacy. The siege of Acre represented not just a military objective, but a chance at personal and political redemption. Saladin, on the other hand, had emerged as the most powerful Muslim leader in the region. His recent string of victories, including the capture of Jerusalem, had galvanized the Muslim world and posed a significant threat to the Crusader states. For Saladin, Acre represented a critical stronghold that, if held, would secure his control over the coastal regions and prevent the Crusaders from re-establishing a foothold in the Holy Land. The Crusader force that gathered outside Acre was a diverse and complex assemblage. At its core were the remnants of the Kingdom of Jerusalem, bolstered by fresh arrivals from Europe. The army included knights from various European nations, each bringing their own martial traditions and equipment. These heavy cavalry units were supported by infantry, including crossbowmen and spearmen, as well as siege specialists and engineers. One of the strengths of the Crusader army lay in its religious fervor. Many of the soldiers believed they were fighting not just for territorial gain, but for the glory of Christendom and the salvation of their souls. This spiritual motivation often translated into fierce determination on the battlefield, allowing the Crusaders to endure hardships that might have broken less committed forces. However, the Crusader army also faced significant challenges. The loss of Jerusalem and other key strongholds meant that they lacked a secure base of operations. Supply lines were tenuous, stretching across the Mediterranean and relying heavily on Italian merchant fleets. Moreover, the diverse nature of the force, while providing a wide range of skills and resources, also led to internal tensions and disagreements over strategy and leadership. Saladin's army, by contrast, was a more cohesive force, united under his charismatic leadership. Years of successful campaigns had honed the Muslim forces into a well-oiled military machine. Saladin's army was renowned for its mobility, often employing hit-and-run tactics that kept their opponents off balance. The core of his force consisted of highly skilled mounted archers, capable of unleashing devastating volleys of arrows before swiftly retreating. Saladin's recent victories had not only expanded his territory, but also swelled the ranks of his army, with new recruits eager to fight for Islam. His forces were well supplied, drawing resources from a vast empire that stretched from Egypt to Syria. This logistical advantage would prove crucial in the prolonged siege to come. The religious and political context of the conflict added layers of complexity to the motivations of both sides. For the Crusaders, the fall of Jerusalem had been a devastating blow to Christendom. The siege of Acre was seen as the first step in reclaiming the Holy City and re-establishing Christian control over the sacred sites of the Levant. Many European nobles and knights saw participation in the siege as a means of gaining spiritual merit and worldly fame. For Saladin and his forces, the defense of Acre was part of a broader struggle to unite the Muslim world under a single banner and push the Christian invaders out of Muslim lands. Saladin had skillfully used the idea of jihad to rally support from across the Islamic world, framing the conflict as a religious duty to defend the faith against foreign aggression. The logistical challenges faced by both sides were immense. The Crusaders, operating far from their home territories, had to rely on long and vulnerable supply lines. Food, water, and military supplies had to be shipped across the Mediterranean, a journey fraught with dangers from both nature and enemy raids. The arrival of winter would pose additional challenges, as storms could cut off these vital lifelines for weeks at a time. Saladin's forces, while better supplied, faced their own set of challenges. The need to maintain a large army in the field for an extended period would strain even his considerable resources. Moreover, the diverse nature of his coalition, which included troops from Egypt, Syria, and other parts of the Muslim world, required careful management to maintain cohesion and morale. As the two armies converged on Acre, the stage was set for a confrontation that would test the limits of human endurance and military ingenuity. The Crusaders, numbering around 9,700 men, found themselves facing a garrison of approximately 20,000 defenders within the city walls. This numerical disparity would normally have made a siege untenable, but the Crusaders were bolstered by the knowledge that reinforcements were en route from Europe. The stark contrast in numbers revealed a fundamental truth about medieval siege warfare: the enormous advantages enjoyed by defenders. Acre's formidable walls and towers, coupled with its larger garrison, meant that any assault would likely result in catastrophic losses for the attackers. The Crusaders would need to rely on siege engines, psychological warfare, and possibly treachery within the city if they hoped to overcome these odds. The siege begins. Initial strategies and challenges. As the Crusaders approached Acre, they faced a daunting challenge: how to conquer a city when outnumbered more than 2 to 1. Their solution would defy conventional military wisdom and set the stage for one of the most extraordinary sieges in medieval history. The Crusader army, led by Guy of Lusignan, arrived at Acre in August 1189. As they gazed upon the city's formidable defences, the magnitude of their task became apparent. Acre's walls, strengthened over centuries of conflict, loomed before them. The natural harbour, while tempting as a potential supply route, was heavily guarded by the city's defenders. The Crusaders' initial assessment revealed that a direct assault would be suicidal, given their numerical disadvantage. Faced with these seemingly insurmountable odds, Guy made a bold decision. Instead of retreating or launching a desperate attack, he ordered his forces to establish a siege camp. This strategy, while risky, offered the Crusaders their best chance of success. By cutting off Acre from the surrounding countryside and maintaining a constant presence, they hoped to slowly strangle the city into submission. The Crusaders' camp took shape on the plains outside Acre's walls. Engineers and labourers worked tirelessly to construct a series of fortifications, including wooden palisades and earthen ramparts. These defences served a dual purpose. They protected the Crusaders from potential sorties by the garrison, and created a barrier against any relief force that might attempt to break the siege. Inside Acre, the garrison was not idle. Under the command of Baha ad-Din Karakush, an experienced Mamluk officer, the defenders prepared for a prolonged conflict. They stockpiled food and water, reinforced weak points in the walls, and positioned artillery to counter any Crusader assault. The city's diverse population, including Christians, Muslims, and Jews, was organized into work details to support the defense effort. The early stages of the siege saw a crucial naval dimension unfold. The Crusaders recognized that controlling the sea approaches to Acre was essential for their success. They deployed a fleet of ships to blockade the harbour, aiming to prevent any resupply or reinforcement of the city by sea. However, this naval force was initially small and poorly coordinated, allowing some vessels to slip through their cordon. As the siege settled into a pattern, both sides engaged in probing attacks and skirmishes. The Crusaders launched several small-scale assaults on Acre's outer defences, testing for weaknesses and keeping the defenders on edge. These attacks, while rarely successful in breaching the walls, served to gather intelligence and maintain the offensive initiative. The defenders of Acre responded with their own sorties, attempting to disrupt the Crusader siege works and gather information about their enemies' dispositions. These raids, often conducted under the cover of darkness, forced the Crusaders to remain vigilant and diverted resources to maintain their defensive perimeter. Despite their numerical advantage, the garrison of Acre found themselves in an increasingly precarious position. The Crusader blockade, though imperfect, began to take its toll on the city's supplies. Food rationing was implemented, and the defenders looked anxiously to the horizon for signs of relief. That relief would soon materialize in the form of Saladin's army. As news of the siege reached the Sultan, he mobilized his forces and marched towards Acre. The Crusaders now faced the prospect of being caught between the city's defenders and a powerful relief army. This development added a new layer of complexity to the siege, forcing Guy of Lusignan to adapt his strategy. In a remarkable display of medieval military engineering, the Crusaders transformed their siege camp into a fortified city of their own. They dug a deep trench around their position, using the earth to build a high rampart. This improvised fortress allowed the Crusaders to maintain their siege of Acre, while simultaneously defending against Saladin's approaching army. The arrival of Saladin's forces in September 1189 marked a turning point in the siege. The Sultan's army took up positions on the hills overlooking Acre, effectively besieging the besiegers. This created a unique and complex military situation. The garrison of Acre was besieged by the Crusaders, who were in turn encircled by Saladin's army. Despite being outnumbered and caught between two hostile forces, the Crusaders managed to maintain their position through a combination of tactical skill and sheer determination. Their fortified camp proved resilient against attacks from both the city and Saladin's army. The Crusaders also benefited from their control of the sea, which allowed them to receive reinforcements and supplies, albeit irregularly. The siege of Acre had now evolved into a war of attrition, with all three parties, the city's defenders, the Crusaders, and Saladin's army, locked in a deadly stalemate. Each side sought to outlast the others, knowing that time and resources would ultimately determine the victor. The double siege, Saladin's gambit. The arrival of Saladin's relief force in September 1189 marked a pivotal moment in the siege of Acre, transforming the conflict into a complex military scenario rarely seen in medieval warfare. As Saladin's army approached, the Crusaders found themselves in an unprecedented predicament. They were now caught between the fortified walls of Acre and a massive Muslim force threatening their rear. This development presented a unique challenge that would test the limits of medieval military strategy and push both sides to their breaking points. Saladin's strategy was as bold as it was cunning. Rather than engaging the Crusaders in a direct assault, he opted to encircle their camp, effectively creating a siege within a siege. This maneuver not only protected Acre from the Crusaders, but also placed immense pressure on the Christian forces. The Muslim army established a series of fortified positions on the hills surrounding the Crusader camp, creating a formidable ring that threatened to strangle the besiegers. Faced with this new threat, the Crusaders were forced to hastily construct defensive fortifications to protect their rear. They dug deep trenches and erected wooden palisades, transforming their siege camp into a makeshift fortress. This rapid construction was a testament to the Crusaders' adaptability, but it also highlighted the precariousness of their position. Every man engaged in building defenses was one less soldier available to maintain the siege of Acre or to face Saladin's forces in open battle. The psychological impact of being surrounded on the Crusaders was profound. The constant threat of attack from both the city and Saladin's army created a pervasive sense of vulnerability. Morale began to waver as the reality of their situation set in. The Crusaders, who had arrived with the intention of being the besiegers, now found themselves besieged. This reversal of fortunes challenged their confidence and tested their resolve. The logistical challenges of maintaining two siege lines were enormous. The Crusaders now had to divide their forces and resources between pressing the siege of Acre and defending against Saladin's army. This division of attention and manpower weakened their overall position. Food and water became increasingly scarce as supply lines were stretched thin. The Crusaders had to carefully ration their provisions, knowing that any weakness could be exploited by either the defenders of Acre or Saladin's forces. Saladin's encirclement strategy also presented significant challenges for his own army. Maintaining a prolonged siege required vast amounts of resources and careful planning. The Muslim forces had to establish their own supply lines and fortifications while remaining vigilant against potential Crusader counterattacks. The complex terrain around Acre, with its hills and valleys, made coordination between different sections of Saladin's army difficult. As the siege dragged on, tensions mounted on all sides. The defenders of Acre, while temporarily relieved by Saladin's arrival, still faced dwindling supplies and the constant threat of Crusader assaults. The Crusaders, caught between two hostile forces, had to remain ever vigilant, never knowing from which direction the next attack might come. Saladin's army, while in a position of strength, faced the challenge of sustaining a large force in the field for an extended period. The inevitability of a clash between the three forces loomed large over the battlefield. Each side sought to gain an advantage, probing for weaknesses and attempting to break the stalemate. Skirmishes and small-scale engagements became frequent occurrences as all parties tested their opponent's defenses. The tension was palpable, with everyone aware that a major battle could erupt at any moment. This three-way conflict presented unique tactical challenges. The Crusaders had to be prepared to pivot their defenses rapidly, potentially fighting on two fronts simultaneously. Saladin's forces needed to coordinate their attacks with the defenders of Acre to maximize their effectiveness. The garrison of Acre had to time their sorties carefully to coincide with pressure from Saladin's army. The siege of Acre had now evolved into a complex, three-way conflict that defied conventional medieval military doctrine. It was no longer a simple matter of one force attempting to breach the walls of a city. Instead, it had become an intricate game of strategy, with each side trying to outmaneuver the others while preserving their own strength. This unprecedented situation demanded innovation in tactics and technology. The traditional methods of siege warfare were no longer sufficient to break the stalemate. Both the Crusaders and Saladin's forces began to experiment with new siege engines and defensive structures. The siege of Acre became a crucible for military innovation, with each side striving to gain a technological edge over their opponents. Siege engines and fortifications, the arms race. As the siege of Acre intensified, a technological arms race unfolded that would redefine medieval warfare. The ingenuity of engineers on both sides transformed simple materials like wood and stone into devastating machines of destruction. This contest of minds behind the lines would prove just as crucial as the clashes on the battlefield. Siege engines, the medieval equivalent of heavy artillery, played a pivotal role in the assault on Acre's formidable defenses. These massive machines were designed to overcome the high walls and towers that had protected cities for centuries. The most prominent among them was the trebuchet, a sophisticated catapult capable of hurling projectiles weighing hundreds of pounds over great distances. The construction of a trebuchet was a feat of engineering in itself. Skilled craftsmen assembled massive wooden frames, often standing over 60 feet tall. At the heart of the machine was a long beam acting as a lever, with a heavy counterweight on one end and a sling to hold the projectile on the other. When released, the counterweight would drop, causing the beam to pivot and launch the projectile with tremendous force. During the siege of Acre, both the Crusaders and Saladin's forces employed trebuchets to devastating effect. These engines could launch not only large stones, but also incendiary materials and even biological weapons, such as diseased animal carcasses. The psychological impact of these bombardments was often as significant as the physical damage they inflicted. Alongside the trebuchet, siege towers played a crucial role in the assault on Acre's walls. These massive wooden structures, sometimes reaching heights of over 70 feet, were wheeled close to the city walls to allow attackers to engage defenders at close range. The towers were typically covered in raw hides soaked in vinegar or alum to protect them from fire arrows. The construction and deployment of siege towers presented numerous challenges. Engineers had to ensure the structure was tall enough to overlook the city walls, while remaining stable enough to support the weight of soldiers and equipment. Moving these behemoths across uneven terrain towards the city walls was a slow and perilous process, often undertaken under a hail of arrows and stones from the defenders. As the Crusaders and Saladin's forces vied for superiority in siege technology, the defenders of Acre were not idle. They developed increasingly sophisticated countermeasures to neutralize the threat posed by these engines of war. One of the most effective defensive tools was the counterweight trebuchet, which could match or even exceed the range and power of the attacking siege engines. The defenders also employed a variety of other tactics to repel assaults. They used hooks and grappling irons to topple siege towers and ladders. Boiling oil, heated sand, and Greek fire, a mysterious incendiary substance that could not be extinguished with water, were poured onto attackers attempting to scale the walls. The garrison even constructed wooden hoardings, covered galleries that projected from the tops of walls, allowing defenders to rain missiles down on enemies directly below. Another crucial aspect of siege warfare that came into play at Acre was the use of sappers and miners. These specialized troops worked to undermine the foundations of walls and towers, often digging tunnels beneath them. The goal was to cause sections of the fortifications to collapse, creating breaches for the attacking army to exploit. The work of sappers was incredibly dangerous and required great skill. They had to navigate underground, often in complete darkness, while avoiding detection by the enemy. If discovered, they risked being trapped and suffocated as defenders flooded their tunnels or used countermines to intercept them. The psychological impact of mining operations was significant, as defenders lived in constant fear that their walls might suddenly crumble beneath them. As the siege of Acre dragged on, both sides continually refined their siege engines and tactics. The Crusaders, drawing on expertise from across Europe, introduced innovations such as the counterweight trebuchet, which offered greater accuracy and power than earlier torsion-powered catapults. Saladin's forces, meanwhile, leveraged the engineering knowledge of the Islamic world, which had preserved and built upon the siegecraft traditions of ancient Rome and Persia. The escalating use of siege engines at Acre marked a significant evolution in medieval warfare. Traditional methods of siegecraft, such as starving out a garrison or attempting to scale walls with ladders, were supplemented by increasingly sophisticated and destructive technologies. This shift would have far-reaching consequences for castle design and military strategy in the centuries to come. As the bombardment of Acre intensified, the human cost of the siege became increasingly apparent. The constant barrage of stones, fire, and disease-ridden projectiles took a heavy toll on the defenders and civilian population alike. Buildings crumbled, fires raged, and the streets became littered with debris and bodies. The psychological impact of living under such conditions was immense, with the constant threat of sudden death or injury weighing heavily on all within the city walls. The human cost, life and death in a besieged city. As the siege of Acre dragged on, the conditions within the city walls deteriorated rapidly. The initial optimism of the defenders gave way to a grim reality as food stores dwindled and water sources became contaminated. The once bustling streets of this cosmopolitan port city fell silent, save for the constant thud of projectiles and the groans of the wounded and dying. The food situation quickly became dire. With the harbour blockaded by Crusader ships, the city's usual influx of supplies was cut off. The garrison and civilian population were forced to ration their dwindling stores. As weeks turned to months, the menu of the besieged became increasingly meagre and unpalatable. Grain stores were stretched with sawdust, and the wealthy found themselves competing with the poor for scraps of bread. Reports even emerged of desperate citizens resorting to consuming rats, dogs, and other animals typically considered unfit for human consumption. Water, always a precious commodity in the arid climate of the Levant, became a source of both life and death. The city's wells and cisterns, normally sufficient for its population, were strained to the breaking point. As the siege wore on, many of these water sources became contaminated with waste and disease. The choice between dehydration and drinking potentially lethal water became a daily gamble for Acre's inhabitants. The breakdown of sanitation systems compounded the misery within the walls. With no way to properly dispose of waste and corpses, the streets became breeding grounds for disease. Dysentery, typhoid, and other ailments spread rapidly through the weakened population. The city's hospitals and infirmaries, initially well equipped to handle the wounds of battle, soon found themselves overwhelmed by the sheer number of sick and injured. The constant bombardment from Crusader siege engines took a devastating psychological toll on Acre's defenders and civilians alike. The unpredictable nature of the attacks meant that no one was ever truly safe, even within the shelter of stone buildings. The sound of approaching projectiles became a source of constant terror, with citizens never knowing if the next impact would bring down their home or claim the lives of loved ones. This psychological warfare extended beyond the physical danger. The isolation of being cut off from the outside world, combined with the knowledge that Saladin's relief force was unable to break through, led to a pervasive sense of hopelessness. Morale among the defenders fluctuated wildly, with periods of renewed determination often followed by crushing despair. Yet even in these dire circumstances, instances of heroism and self-sacrifice emerged. The city's defenders worked tirelessly to repair breaches in the walls, often exposing themselves to enemy fire in the process. Civilian volunteers assisted in caring for the wounded and sick, despite the risk of contracting diseases themselves. Religious leaders of all faiths within the diverse city offered spiritual comfort and organized communal prayers for deliverance. As the siege stretched on, the breaking point of human endurance drew ever nearer. The combination of malnutrition, disease, and constant stress began to take its toll on the physical and mental health of the population. Cases of severe depression and mental breakdowns became increasingly common. The social fabric of the city began to fray, with incidents of theft and violence on the rise as desperate citizens fought for survival. The devastating impact of the siege on Acre's civilian population cannot be overstated. By some estimates, as much as a third of the city's pre-siege population perished during the conflict. The dead included not only those killed directly by enemy action, but also the countless victims of starvation, disease, and the collapse of civil order. Families were torn apart, centuries-old communities were shattered, and the vibrant cultural tapestry of Acre was irreparably damaged. The plight of Acre's civilians stood in stark contrast to the military nature of the conflict. While soldiers on both sides fought for glory, faith, or duty, it was the non-combatants who often paid the highest price. The siege laid bare the brutal reality that in medieval warfare, there was often little distinction made between military and civilian targets. As the situation within Acre deteriorated, the challenges faced by the besieging Crusaders also mounted. The prolonged nature of the siege strained their resources and tested their resolve. Disease and desertion began to thin their ranks, and the constant threat of Saladin's forces at their rear meant they could never fully focus on the assault on the city. Crusaders under pressure, maintaining the siege. The Crusaders' camp outside Acre was a bustling city in its own right, a testament to medieval military engineering and logistics. Stretching across the coastal plain, the camp was a complex network of fortifications, tents, and improvised structures. The perimeter was ringed with deep trenches and high earthen ramparts, supplemented by wooden palisades and watchtowers. These defences were not merely for show. They were a vital barrier against the twin threats of Saladin's army and potential sorties from Acre's garrison. Within this makeshift fortress, the Crusaders faced a logistical nightmare that would have daunted even the most seasoned commanders. Cut off from friendly territory and hemmed in by hostile forces, the army's very survival hinged on its ability to maintain a steady flow of supplies. The challenge was immense: how to feed, equip, and maintain the fighting spirit of thousands of men in what amounted to a hostile desert. The answer lay, in large part, with the sea. The Mediterranean, long a highway for trade and warfare, became the Crusaders' lifeline. A constant stream of ships from European ports braved the perilous journey to deliver crucial supplies. These vessels, laden with food, weaponry, and fresh troops, had to run a gauntlet of Muslim ships attempting to break the naval blockade of Acre. The success of these maritime supply lines was critical. Without them, the siege would have collapsed within weeks. Yet even with this naval support, the Crusaders' situation remained precarious. The sheer volume of supplies required to sustain such a large force was staggering. Each day brought new challenges: how to distribute limited rations fairly, how to maintain hygiene in overcrowded conditions, how to care for the sick and wounded with dwindling medical supplies. The camp's leaders grappled with these issues daily, knowing that failure in any of these areas could spell disaster for the entire campaign. Maintaining morale in such conditions was a Herculean task. The initial fervor that had driven many to take up the cross began to wane in the face of constant hardship and danger. The monotony of siege warfare, punctuated by sudden bursts of violence, wore on even the most stalwart knights. Religious devotion, a key motivator for many crusaders, was tested by the harsh realities of their situation. Priests and military leaders alike worked to keep spirits high, organizing religious services and reminding the troops of the holy nature of their mission. Despite these efforts, dissension and conflict within the crusader ranks were inevitable. The army was a patchwork of different nationalities, each with its own customs, languages, and agendas. Tensions flared over issues of strategy, resource allocation, and leadership. Some contingents, frustrated by the lack of progress, advocated for more aggressive assaults on Acre's walls. Others, wary of the cost in lives, argued for a more cautious approach. These disagreements sometimes erupted into open conflict, threatening the cohesion of the entire force. The spectre of disease loomed large over the Crusader camp. The crowded, unsanitary conditions were a breeding ground for illness. Dysentery, typhoid, and other maladies spread rapidly through the ranks. The medical knowledge of the time was ill-equipped to deal with such outbreaks, and many soldiers succumbed to disease rather than enemy action. The constant attrition from illness and sporadic combat slowly whittled away at the Crusaders' numbers, making the arrival of reinforcements all the more crucial. As the siege dragged on, the Crusaders had to contend with the changing seasons. The summer heat brought its own challenges, with water becoming an increasingly precious commodity. The arrival of winter, while providing some respite from the heat, brought new hardships. Cold, wet conditions led to increased illness and made the already difficult task of maintaining siege equipment even more challenging. Despite these severe hardships, the Crusaders managed to maintain their position through a combination of resilience, innovation, and sheer determination. They adapted to their circumstances, developing new tactics and technologies to counter both the defenders of Acre and Saladin's forces. The siege camp became a crucible of military innovation, with new designs for siege engines and fortifications being constantly tested and refined. The Crusaders also learned to exploit the few advantages their position offered. The coastal location allowed for fishing expeditions, supplementing their diet with fresh seafood. They scavenged materials from abandoned villages and repurposed them for their own needs. Every resource, no matter how small, was utilized to its fullest extent. New blood, the arrival of Conrad of Montferrat. The arrival of Conrad of Montferrat in the spring of 1189 marked a pivotal moment in the siege of Acre. As the Crusaders struggled to maintain their position, this Italian nobleman's unexpected appearance would breathe new life into their flagging campaign. Conrad, a seasoned military commander and skilled diplomat, sailed into the besieged port with a small but well-equipped force, bringing not only fresh troops, but also much-needed supplies and a renewed sense of purpose. Conrad's journey to Acre was itself a tale of daring and fortune. Having narrowly escaped capture by Saladin's forces in Tyre, he had rallied the city's defenders and successfully repelled the Muslim assault. This victory had earned him a reputation as a formidable leader and strategist, qualities that would prove invaluable in the complex political landscape of the Crusader states. Upon his arrival, Conrad quickly assessed the dire situation facing the Crusader army. The prolonged siege had taken its toll on both morale and resources, with disease and hunger ravaging the ranks. Recognizing the need for immediate action, Conrad set about reorganizing the Crusader forces, implementing stricter discipline and more efficient distribution of supplies. The political implications of Conrad's arrival were immediate and far-reaching. As a member of the influential Montferrat family, Conrad possessed significant connections to European nobility. His presence complicated the already delicate power dynamics within the Crusader camp, particularly in relation to Guy of Lusignan, the former king of Jerusalem. Conrad's successes in Tyre had earned him the support of many crusaders, who saw him as a more capable leader than the beleaguered Guy. This political tension would eventually lead to a schism within the Crusader ranks, with some supporting Conrad's claim to the throne of Jerusalem, while others remained loyal to Guy. Despite these internal conflicts, Conrad's diplomatic skills proved crucial in maintaining a semblance of unity among the diverse factions of the Crusader army. From a military perspective, Conrad's reinforcements, though relatively small in number, had a disproportionate impact on the siege. His troops were well trained and experienced in siege warfare, having successfully defended Tyre against Saladin's forces. Conrad introduced new tactics and technologies that he had employed in Tyre, including improvements to existing siege engines and the construction of more robust defensive fortifications. One of Conrad's most significant contributions was his emphasis on naval warfare. Recognizing the critical importance of maintaining supply lines, he orchestrated a series of naval engagements aimed at breaking the Muslim blockade of Acre's harbour. In a daring operation, Conrad led a fleet of crusader ships against the Egyptian vessels that had been harassing their supply convoys. The ensuing battle was fierce, with both sides employing Greek fire and other naval weaponry. The crusader fleet, bolstered by Conrad's tactical acumen, managed to outmaneuver the Egyptian ships, sinking several and forcing the rest to retreat. This victory secured the sea lanes, allowing for a more consistent flow of supplies and reinforcements from Europe. The improved logistics had an immediate effect on the Crusader army's capabilities, enabling them to sustain their siege efforts with renewed vigor. Saladin's forces, observing the reinvigoration of the Crusader army, responded by intensifying their own efforts to break the siege. The Muslim leader recognized the threat posed by Conrad's arrival and sought to neutralize this new advantage before it could be fully leveraged. Saladin launched a series of probing attacks against the Crusader lines, testing for weaknesses in their newly strengthened defenses. These assaults, while fierce, were met with a level of resistance that surprised the Muslim forces. Conrad had implemented a more flexible defensive strategy, allowing the Crusaders to quickly reinforce threatened sectors of their lines. This adaptability, combined with the improved morale of the troops, enabled the Crusaders to repel Saladin's attacks with minimal losses. The shift in the balance of power did not go unnoticed by the defenders of Acre. Reports of Conrad's arrival and the subsequent Crusader victories spread throughout the city, eroding the resolve of the garrison. The prospect of relief from Saladin's army, which had seemed increasingly unlikely, now appeared even more remote. As the siege progressed, Conrad's influence continued to grow. He advocated for a more aggressive approach, arguing that the Crusaders should seize the initiative rather than simply maintaining their siege lines. This strategy led to a series of coordinated assaults on Acre's defenses, each more sophisticated than the last. While these attacks did not immediately breach the city walls, they served to keep the defenders off balance and further strain their dwindling resources. The arrival of Conrad of Montferrat had fundamentally altered the dynamics of the siege. What had been a war of attrition, with the Crusaders slowly losing ground, had transformed into a more dynamic and unpredictable conflict. The reinvigorated Crusader army, now better led and supplied, posed a far more serious threat to both the defenders of Acre and Saladin's relief force. Escalation, the battle for Acre's walls. The renewed Crusader efforts to breach Acre's defenses marked a critical escalation in the siege. With the arrival of Conrad of Montferrat and the implementation of new tactics, the Crusaders set their sights on the formidable walls that had thus far resisted their assaults. The defenders, acutely aware of the heightened threat, prepared for what would become some of the most intense fighting of the entire campaign. The Crusaders' primary strategy centered on the use of massive siege towers, towering wooden structures that dwarfed the city walls. These behemoths, some reaching heights of over 70 feet, were painstakingly constructed, from wood shipped across the Mediterranean. The towers were multi-level affairs, with the lower levels housing battering rams, and the upper levels providing platforms for archers and crossbowmen to rain arrows upon the defenders. As these colossal structures inched closer to Acre's walls, the defenders' desperation mounted. They knew that if the towers reached the walls, the city's fall would be all but inevitable. In response, they employed a range of tactics to repel the advancing threat. Boiling oil and heated sand were stockpiled near the battlements, ready to be poured onto any crusaders who managed to scale the walls. But the defenders' most potent weapon was Greek fire, a highly flammable substance that could not be extinguished with water. The exact composition of Greek fire remains a mystery to this day, but its effectiveness was undeniable. Launched from specially designed siphons, the liquid flames clung to whatever they touched, turning siege engines and men alike into infernos. The use of Greek fire was not without risk to the defenders themselves. The volatile substance was as dangerous to those deploying it as it was to the enemy. Accidents during its preparation or deployment could result in catastrophic fires within the city. Despite these risks, the defenders knew that Greek fire represented their best chance of repelling the Crusader assault. As the siege towers drew near, the intensity of the fighting reached fever pitch. Crusader archers on the upper levels of the towers exchanged volleys with defenders on the walls. The air was thick with arrows, bolts, and stones hurled from trebuchets on both sides. The cacophony of battle was deafening, with the crash of stone against stone, the creaking of wooden siege engines, and the screams of the wounded creating a hellish soundscape. When the towers finally reached the walls, the fighting devolved into brutal hand-to-hand combat. Crusaders poured from the towers onto the battlements, engaging the defenders in close quarters, fighting with swords, maces, and axes. The narrow walkways atop the walls became slaughterhouses, with men fighting and dying in spaces barely wide enough for two to stand abreast. The psychological toll of these repeated assaults was immense on both sides. For the defenders, each crusader that gained a foothold on the walls represented a potential breach that could lead to the city's fall. The constant state of alertness, coupled with the strain of repelling assault after assault, wore heavily on their minds and bodies. The crusaders, for their part, faced the daunting task of scaling walls under a hail of arrows, rocks, and burning oil. Each attempt carried the very real possibility of a gruesome death. The sight of comrades falling from the walls or burning alive in Greek fire tested the resolve of even the most battle-hardened knights. As the assaults continued day after day, both sides teetered on the brink of exhaustion. The defenders rotated troops to allow for rest, but with their numbers dwindling, these respites grew shorter. The Crusaders, driven by religious fervor and the promise of glory, pushed themselves to the limits of human endurance. Just as it seemed the Crusaders might finally breach the defenses, disaster struck. In a coordinated attack, the defenders unleashed a barrage of Greek fire on the siege towers. The flames spread rapidly, engulfing the wooden structures. Crusaders trapped on the upper levels faced a horrifying choice: burn alive or leap to their deaths. The destruction of the siege towers was a crushing blow to the Crusader efforts. Months of work and countless lives had been invested in their construction and deployment. As the towers burned, thick black smoke billowed into the sky, visible for miles around. To the defenders, it was a sign of divine favor. To the Crusaders, it was a stark reminder of the challenges they faced. In the aftermath of this setback, the Crusaders were forced to reassess their strategy. The loss of the siege towers represented not just a tactical defeat, but a significant drain on morale. Many began to question whether Acre could be taken at all, given the resourcefulness and determination of its defenders. Saladin's gamble, attempts to break the siege. As the Crusaders grappled with their losses, Saladin recognized an opportunity to turn the tide of the siege. The Muslim leader began assembling a massive force of 160,000 men, drawing reinforcements from across his vast empire. This formidable army represented a dire threat to the Crusaders, who now found themselves caught in a precarious position between Acre's unyielding walls and Saladin's approaching juggernaut. Saladin's preparations were meticulous. He established a network of supply depots along his planned route of advance, ensuring his troops would be well provisioned for the upcoming battles. The Sultan also dispatched swift riders to Acre, carrying detailed plans for coordinating their efforts with the besieged garrison. These messages outlined a complex strategy that would require precise timing and execution from both forces to succeed. The Crusaders, aware of the impending onslaught, scrambled to fortify their position. They deepened their trenches, reinforced their wooden palisades, and positioned their most experienced units at critical points along their defensive line. Conrad of Montferrat, drawing on his strategic acumen, implemented a flexible defense system that allowed for rapid redeployment of troops to threatened sectors. As Saladin's army approached, the tension in the Crusader camp became palpable. The besiegers, who had grown accustomed to being the aggressors, now faced the prospect of defending against a force that vastly outnumbered them. The psychological strain was immense, with many Crusaders fearing they would be overwhelmed and annihilated between Saladin's relief force and Acre's defenders. The first clash came as Saladin's vanguard engaged the Crusader outposts. The fighting was fierce, with both sides acutely aware of the stakes. Saladin's troops pushed hard, seeking to create a breach in the Crusader lines through which the main force could pour. The Crusaders, however, held firm, their resolve strengthened by the knowledge that retreat meant certain death. As the battle raged, Saladin attempted to coordinate his assault with a sortie from Acre's garrison. The plan called for the defenders to strike at the Crusaders' rear, dividing their attention and resources. However, the execution fell short of expectations. Years of siege had taken their toll on Acre's defenders, and their attack lacked the necessary force to significantly impact the Crusader defenses. The fighting continued for days, with Saladin launching a series of probing attacks along the Crusader lines, searching for weak points. Each assault was met with determined resistance, as the Crusaders fought with the desperation of men who knew defeat meant annihilation. The casualties mounted on both sides, with the battlefield becoming a grotesque tableau of death and suffering. Despite the intensity of the combat, a stalemate began to emerge. Saladin's numerical advantage was offset by the Crusaders' strong defensive position and the difficulty of coordinating attacks with Acre's beleaguered garrison. The Muslim leader found himself in a quandary, unable to bring his full strength to bear effectively against the entrenched Crusaders. As the battles dragged on, the impact on morale became increasingly apparent. Among Saladin's troops, frustration grew at their inability to break through to Acre. The initial confidence that their overwhelming numbers would ensure victory gave way to doubt and fatigue. Conversely, the Crusaders' spirits were buoyed by their successful defense. Each repelled attack reinforced their belief in the strength of their position and their ability to withstand Saladin's offensives. The Muslim leader, recognizing the shifting momentum, began to consider alternative strategies. He ordered his engineers to construct siege engines of their own, hoping to match the Crusaders' firepower. However, the time required to build these machines allowed the Crusaders to further strengthen their defenses, negating much of the potential impact. In a bold move, Saladin attempted to cut off the Crusaders' maritime supply lines. He dispatched a fleet to challenge the Christian ships that had been providing a lifeline of resources to the besieging army. The ensuing naval battle was chaotic and bloody, with ships grappling and boarding each other in close-quarters combat. Ultimately, the Crusader fleet, bolstered by experienced Pisan and Genoese sailors, managed to repel the attack and maintain their control of the sea lanes. As weeks turned into months, it became increasingly clear that Saladin's gambit had failed. Despite the massive size of his relief force, he had been unable to dislodge the Crusaders from their positions around Acre. The Muslim army, facing supply difficulties of its own, and demoralized by the lack of progress, began to lose its cohesion. Desertion rates rose, particularly among the troops from distant provinces who had little personal stake in the conflict. Royal intervention, Richard the Lionheart, and Philip Augustus arrive. The arrival of Richard I of England and Philip II of France in the spring of 1191 marked a pivotal moment in the siege of Acre. These two powerful monarchs brought not only fresh troops and resources, but also a complex web of political ambitions that would reshape the dynamics of the conflict. Their presence injected new vigor into the Crusader ranks, transforming a protracted stalemate into a decisive engagement that would ultimately determine the fate of the city. The journey of Richard and Philip to the Holy Land was fraught with challenges. Richard's fleet encountered severe storms in the Mediterranean, forcing him to winter in Sicily. This delay allowed tensions to simmer between the two monarchs, as Philip arrived in Acre first, in April 1191. Richard's dramatic entrance a month later, complete with a show of naval strength, immediately shifted the balance of power within the Crusader camp. The political landscape of the siege became increasingly complex with the arrival of these royal figures. The existing power struggle between Guy of Lusignan and Conrad of Montferrat for the throne of Jerusalem was now complicated by the presence of two influential kings, each with their own agendas. Philip, who had long-standing ties to the Montferrat family, threw his support behind Conrad, while Richard initially backed Guy's claim. This internal discord threatened to undermine the unity of the Crusader forces at a critical juncture. Despite these political tensions, the military impact of the royal reinforcements was immediate and significant. Richard and Philip brought with them not only seasoned troops, but also advanced siege technology that would prove instrumental in breaking the deadlock. The English contingent, in particular, introduced more powerful trebuchets capable of hurling larger projectiles with greater accuracy. These new engines could launch stones weighing up to 300 pounds, significantly outperforming the existing siege weapons. The Crusader strategy underwent a dramatic shift under royal leadership. Richard, known for his military acumen, implemented a more aggressive approach to the siege. He ordered the construction of a series of covered galleries, known as cats, which allowed sappers to approach the city walls under protection. These structures were built on rollers, enabling them to be moved closer to the fortifications as needed. The psychological impact of these new tactics on the defenders of Acre was profound, as they watched the Crusaders inexorably closing in on their positions. In addition to these innovations, Richard introduced the use of Greek fire in offensive operations. This incendiary weapon, traditionally used by Byzantine and Muslim forces for defense, was now turned against the walls of Acre. The sight of flaming projectiles arcing through the sky towards the city must have been terrifying for the defenders, who had long relied on the superiority of their own incendiary weapons. Philip, not to be outdone, contributed his own expertise in siege warfare. The French king ordered the construction of massive siege towers that dwarfed those previously used in the conflict. These towering structures, some reaching heights of over 80 feet, posed a direct threat to the walls of Acre. The defenders watched with growing alarm as these behemoths slowly advanced towards their fortifications. Saladin, recognizing the grave threat posed by the arrival of the European monarchs, redoubled his efforts to break the siege. He launched a series of fierce attacks on the Crusader positions, hoping to disrupt their preparations for a final assault. However, the improved defenses and increased manpower of the Crusader camp proved too resilient. Saladin's forces found themselves caught between the hammer of the reinvigorated Crusader army and the anvil of Acre's beleaguered defenders. The Sultan also attempted to exploit the political divisions within the Crusader ranks. He sent envoys to both Richard and Philip, seeking to negotiate separate peace agreements. These diplomatic overtures, however, were rebuffed. Despite their personal rivalries, the two kings recognized the importance of presenting a united front against their common enemy. As the siege intensified, the advanced technology brought by the English and French forces began to take its toll on Acre's defenses. The constant bombardment from the improved trebuchets weakened sections of the city walls, creating vulnerable points for future assaults. The defenders worked tirelessly to repair the damage, but their resources were dwindling and morale was sinking. The final weeks of the siege saw a flurry of activity as both sides prepared for the decisive confrontation. Richard, despite being struck down with a severe fever, continued to direct operations from his sickbed. His determination inspired the Crusader troops, who redoubled their efforts in the face of mounting casualties. Inside Acre, the situation was becoming desperate. Food supplies were critically low, and disease was rampant. the once mighty garrison had been reduced to a fraction of its original strength. The civilian population, which had endured nearly 2 years of siege, was on the brink of collapse. The defenders looked to Saladin with increasing desperation, but his army, despite its size, was unable to break through the Crusader lines. The final assault, breaching Acre's defences. The final assault on Acre began in July 1191, as the Crusaders, now bolstered by the forces of Richard I and Philip II, prepared for a massive, coordinated attack. The siege had dragged on for nearly 2 years, and both sides were exhausted. However, the arrival of the English and French kings had reinvigorated the Crusader army, bringing not only fresh troops, but also advanced siege technology that would prove decisive in the coming battle. Richard I, despite being bedridden with a severe fever, directed the positioning of his prized trebuchets. These massive machines, capable of hurling stones weighing up to 300 pounds, were strategically placed to target the weakest sections of Acre's walls. The English king's engineers had spent weeks studying the city's defences, identifying stress points and vulnerabilities that could be exploited. Inside Acre, the defenders worked feverishly to shore up their fortifications. They reinforced weak spots with timber and rubble and positioned their own counterweight trebuchets to return fire. The garrison, though severely depleted by disease and starvation, remained determined to hold out. They knew that surrender would likely mean death, and they clung to the hope that Saladin's army might yet break through the Crusader lines. As dawn broke on the day of the assault, the air was thick with tension. Richard's trebuchets began their bombardment, the massive stones arcing high into the air before crashing down on Acre's walls with devastating force. The impact was immediately apparent as sections of the ancient fortifications began to crumble under the relentless barrage. Simultaneously, Philip II's siege towers, towering constructions over 80 feet tall, were pushed towards the walls. These mobile fortresses, filled with archers and crossbowmen, provided covering fire for the troops below. The defenders responded with a hail of arrows, stones, and pots of Greek fire, desperately trying to set the wooden structures ablaze. As the bombardment continued, Crusader sappers began their dangerous work. Protected by wooden galleries known as cats, these specialized troops approached the base of the walls. Their task was to undermine the foundations, digging tunnels beneath the fortifications and supporting them with wooden beams. Once the tunnels were complete, the beams would be set on fire, causing the walls above to collapse. The defenders, aware of the danger posed by the sappers, attempted countermeasures. They dug their own tunnels to intercept the Crusaders, leading to fierce underground battles in cramped, dark spaces. The psychological toll of this subterranean warfare was immense, with both sides knowing that a cave-in could bury them alive at any moment. As the day wore on, the combined effects of the trebuchet bombardment and the sappers' work began to tell. Large sections of Acre's walls started to give way, creating breaches that the Crusaders eagerly exploited. Richard I, rising from his sickbed, donned his armour and led a charge towards one of the gaps, inspiring his troops with his personal bravery. The fighting at the breaches was brutal and chaotic. Crusader knights, their armour glinting in the sun, clashed with the desperate defenders in a maelstrom of steel and blood. The narrow openings in the walls created bottlenecks where men fought and died in tightly packed masses. The din of battle was deafening, with the clash of weapons, the screams of the wounded, and the shouts of commanders all blending into a cacophony of war. As more breaches were opened, the Crusaders began to pour into the city. The fighting now spilled into Acre's streets, with every building and alleyway becoming a potential battleground. The defenders fought with the ferocity of cornered animals, knowing that defeat meant death or enslavement. They used their intimate knowledge of the city's layout to ambush Crusader units, turning narrow streets into killing zones. However, the sheer numbers and momentum of the Crusader assault proved unstoppable. Block by block, street by street, the defenders were pushed back towards the city centre. Civilians, who had endured months of privation and bombardment, now found themselves caught in the midst of a desperate last stand. The Crusaders, battle-hardened and driven by religious fervour, showed little mercy. Houses were ransacked, temples and mosques desecrated, and anyone suspected of being a combatant was put to the sword. The brutality of the assault reflected the pent-up frustrations of a 2-year siege and the Crusaders' belief that they were carrying out God's will. As night fell, pockets of resistance still held out in various parts of the city, but it was clear that Acre's fall was now inevitable. The remaining defenders, their numbers dwindling by the hour, retreated to the citadel, the last stronghold within the city walls. The following morning, with Crusader forces massing for a final assault on the citadel, the inevitable occurred. A white flag appeared above the battlements, signaling the defenders' willingness to negotiate terms of surrender. After nearly 2 years of siege and a day of intense urban warfare, Acre had finally fallen. Aftermath, the cost of victory. As the dust settled on Acre's bloodied streets, a grim reality emerged. The capture of this strategic port was not the end, but rather the beginning of a new and unexpected chapter in the Crusades. The true cost of this victory would prove far steeper than anyone had anticipated, reshaping the political landscape of the entire region. The immediate aftermath of Acre's fall was a scene of chaos and devastation. The city, once a thriving center of trade and culture, now lay in ruins. The relentless bombardment from Crusader siege engines had reduced many of Acre's iconic structures to rubble. The streets were littered with debris, and the air was thick with the acrid smell of smoke and decay. The human toll was equally staggering, with bodies of defenders, attackers, and civilians alike strewn throughout the city. The casualties suffered by both sides throughout the siege were astronomical. The Crusader army, which had started the siege with approximately 9,700 men, had been decimated by disease, starvation, and constant fighting. Conservative estimates suggest that nearly half of the original force had perished during the 2-year ordeal. The defenders of Acre and Saladin's relief force had fared no better. Of the initial 20,000 defenders, it is believed that fewer than 8,000 survived to see the city's fall. Saladin's army, while difficult to quantify precisely, had also suffered significant losses in their repeated attempts to break the siege. The destruction inflicted on Acre and its surroundings was catastrophic. The once imposing walls that had withstood centuries of conflict now lay breached in multiple places. The harbour, a vital lifeline for the city, was choked with the wreckage of ships from both sides. The surrounding countryside, stripped bare to feed the massive armies, would take years to recover its agricultural productivity. The economic impact of this destruction would be felt throughout the region for decades to come. The fate of prisoners and civilians in the aftermath of Acre's fall was a stark reminder of the brutality of medieval warfare. Despite initial negotiations for surrender, the victorious Crusaders showed little mercy. Many of the surviving defenders were executed, their bodies unceremoniously thrown into mass graves or the sea. Civilians who had endured nearly 2 years of siege now faced an uncertain future. Some were taken as slaves, others ransomed, and many more were simply left to fend for themselves in the ruins of their once prosperous city. The political ramifications of Acre's capture were far-reaching and complex. For the Crusaders, the victory provided a much-needed foothold in the Holy Land, but it also exacerbated existing tensions within their ranks. The power struggle between Guy of Lusignan and Conrad of Montferrat for the throne of Jerusalem intensified, threatening to fracture the fragile Crusader alliance. Richard I of England's decision to support Guy's claim, while Philip II of France backed Conrad, added an international dimension to this internal conflict. For Saladin and the Muslim world, the loss of Acre was a severe blow. It not only represented a significant territorial loss, but also damaged Saladin's reputation as the defender of Islam against the Crusader threat. The failure to relieve Acre, despite assembling one of the largest armies of the medieval period, raised questions about Saladin's military prowess and leadership. The true cost of the siege extended far beyond the immediate casualties and destruction. The massive resources expended by both sides had long-lasting economic consequences. The Crusader states, already struggling financially, had been further weakened by the enormous expense of maintaining the siege. Similarly, Saladin's empire faced economic strain from the prolonged conflict, with many provinces experiencing hardship due to the diversion of resources to the war effort. The geopolitical shifts resulting from Acre's fall were equally significant. The balance of power in the Levant had been altered, with the Crusaders now possessing a strategic base from which to launch further operations. However, this victory also galvanized Muslim resistance, leading to increased unity among previously disparate factions. The stage was set for a new phase of the Crusades, one that would see intensified conflict and shifting alliances across the region. As news of Acre's fall spread, its impact reverberated throughout Europe and the Muslim world. In Christian kingdoms, the victory was celebrated as a sign of divine favor and a justification for continued support of the Crusader cause. In Muslim lands, it served as a rallying cry for jihad against the invaders, inspiring a new generation of warriors to take up arms in defense of their faith and territories. The siege of Acre had lasting consequences for the development of military technology and tactics. The innovations in siege warfare, from improved trebuchet designs to more sophisticated mining techniques, would influence military engineers for generations to come. The experience gained in conducting and resisting prolonged sieges would shape military doctrine in both the Christian and Muslim worlds. Legacy: the Siege of Acre in military history. The Siege of Acre in 1189 to 1191 stands as a watershed moment in military history, marking a transformative period in the conduct of medieval warfare. While often overshadowed by more famous battles, this prolonged engagement serves as a microcosm of the evolving nature of siege warfare and the broader strategic considerations that shaped military campaigns during the Crusades. The Siege of Acre challenged conventional wisdom about fortress defense and assault. Traditional views of medieval warfare often conjure images of knights charging across open fields or simple catapults hurling stones at castle walls. However, the reality at Acre was far more complex and sophisticated. The engagement showcased a level of technological innovation and strategic planning that would redefine military operations for centuries to come. One of the most significant developments during the siege was the advancement in siege engine technology. The introduction of the counterweight trebuchet represented a quantum leap in the destructive capability of attacking forces. These machines could hurl projectiles weighing hundreds of pounds with unprecedented accuracy and range, far surpassing the capabilities of earlier torsion-powered catapults. The impact of these weapons was not merely physical. The psychological effect on defenders witnessing the devastating power of these engines was profound. The siege also saw significant innovations in defensive technology. The defenders of Acre developed their own counterweight trebuchets, matching or even exceeding the range and power of the attackers' engines. This arms race in siege technology forced both sides to continually adapt their strategies and tactics. The use of Greek fire, a highly flammable substance that could not be extinguished with water, added another layer of complexity to both offensive and defensive operations. The Siege of Acre also highlighted the importance of naval power in medieval warfare. The ability to maintain or disrupt supply lines became a critical factor in the outcome of the siege. The Crusaders' success in blockading Acre's harbour demonstrated the strategic advantage of controlling sea lanes. This lesson would influence future military planners, emphasizing the need for a balanced approach to land and naval operations in coastal sieges. The protracted nature of the siege underscored the importance of logistics and resource management in medieval warfare. Both the attackers and defenders had to grapple with the challenges of sustaining large armies over an extended period. The siege demonstrated that victory often hinged not just on martial prowess, but on the ability to maintain supply lines, manage resources, and sustain morale over long periods. The Siege of Acre also showcased the evolving role of cavalry in siege warfare. While mounted knights were traditionally seen as the elite shock troops of medieval armies, the siege demonstrated their adaptability to different combat roles. Knights dismounted to lead assaults on the walls, showing that even the most prestigious warriors had to adapt to the demands of siege warfare. The use of mining and counter-mining operations during the siege represented another significant development in military tactics. Sappers on both sides engaged in a deadly underground chess game, attempting to undermine enemy fortifications while simultaneously detecting and neutralizing enemy tunneling efforts. This subterranean warfare added a new dimension to siege tactics and would become a standard feature of future engagements. The siege of Acre also provided valuable lessons in the art of negotiation and diplomacy in warfare. The complex web of alliances, rivalries, and shifting loyalties among the Crusader forces and their Muslim opponents demonstrated that military success often depended on political acumen as much as martial skill. The ability to forge alliances, maintain unity among diverse forces, and exploit divisions within the enemy camp proved crucial to the outcome of the siege. The aftermath of the siege had far-reaching consequences for military doctrine. The experience gained at Acre influenced the design of fortifications throughout Europe and the Middle East. Engineers began to incorporate features that had proven effective during the siege, such as concentric walls, improved flanking towers, and more sophisticated gatehouses. The lessons learned about the importance of water supply and food storage in withstanding long sieges led to the construction of more resilient and self-sufficient fortresses. The siege of Acre also influenced the development of professional standing armies. The prolonged nature of the engagement highlighted the limitations of feudal levies and the need for more disciplined, well-trained forces capable of sustained operations. This realization would contribute to the gradual shift towards professional military organizations in the centuries that followed. The technological and tactical innovations demonstrated at Acre had a ripple effect on military campaigns throughout the medieval world. Subsequent sieges, such as the Siege of Château Gaillard in 1203 to 1204, showed clear influences from the tactics employed at Acre. Military commanders studied the lessons of Acre, incorporating them into their strategies and training regimens. The Siege of Acre stands as a testament to the intricate nature of medieval warfare, encompassing technological innovation, strategic complexity, and profound human cost. This prolonged conflict reshaped military tactics, pushing the boundaries of siege technology and demanding unprecedented logistical efforts. The human toll was staggering, with both combatants and civilians enduring unimaginable hardships. The siege's legacy extends beyond its immediate outcome, influencing fortress design and military organization for generations. As we reflect on Acre, we are reminded that the consequences of protracted conflicts reverberate far beyond the battlefield. The siege's impact on regional politics, economic structures, and societal norms was profound and long-lasting. In examining historical sieges like Acre, we gain valuable insights into the nature of warfare itself, prompting us to consider the ethical implications and long-term consequences of modern military engagements. The lessons of Acre continue to inform our understanding of conflict resolution and the true cost of war in any era.